So my name's Thor Culbras. I'm the CEO of Lighter Capital. I've been a 4-time CEO of venture-backed companies. I'm currently at Lighter Capital. The reason why I joined, I was very intrigued with the overall business model. We effectively loan debt capital to early stage startup companies. And where they're either too early for a bank sort of traditional debt vehicles, or they're too early for, traditional venture capital. And so we kind of bridge that gap between sort of, angel investing and equity investors. So it's been a really intriguing ride.
And it's great. Our company, predictablerevenue.com, actually didn't use your firm. We use our company's based in Canada. We use that type of capital. So, there's lots of types of capital, lots of types of needs, and it's really worked for us.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Aaron Ross wrote Predictable Revenue. It's a book. Also co-authored From Impossible to Inevitable, which was the sequel, with a guy named Jason Lemkin, who started SaaStr, and actually before that, EchoSign. In fact, if anyone is going to SaaStr in San Jose, I'll be there, but only on the 12th, really, doing a workshop. So love to see you there. Let's see, throw it in the chat if you're going to go. And today, again, we're going to talk really about this idea of, because it never gets old, like how to grow faster. And again, I'm really like what I am very focused on, hyper-focused on, is if you understand why you're stuck, it makes it easier to look at how to unstick yourself. Just another fun fact, at least for me. So again, just moved to Vancouver, from Los Angeles to Edinburgh in the UK with 5 of our 9 kids. Literally like just 6 weeks ago. So barely, I wouldn't even say we're adjusted. So we're still adjusting. Our furniture hasn't even arrived yet. I'm still doing lots of calls between kind of like 4 p.m. to 6, 7 p.m. as USA time. But really love it here. It's been freezing, but still it's a really neat city, Edinburgh. If you haven't come, highly recommend it. It's small. It's not too big. It's big enough, but not too big. And just really personable and friendly. And there's a lot happening on the SaaS and sales front. So Thor, you've worked with a lot of companies. Like for the companies,
it's one of the reasons
actually. What?
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was expanding on where we're going. We're actually expanding into the UK as well. So hopefully get an opportunity to meet you face to face sometime.
Yeah, there's a lot happening here, both in the UK itself, as well as around Europe. There's really hitting an inflection point with the amount of kind of startup companies, SaaS companies, technology, sales, expertise. And I think I have a very high level observation. It seems like Europe is a lot more hesitant to embrace the idea of selling. In some parts of the United States, people are all about selling, and there's still a lot of course, people who have negative connotations with the word sales. I think that's even more so in Europe. But again, there's nothing like having a company with revenue goals to kind of force people to embrace the idea of having sales and salespeople and sales processes. And it's just something that you need to have a healthy company. And there's nothing bad about it. At least it doesn't have to be. But I'm still getting to know kind of the culture and around the startups and sales and the way people think about revenue here. But yeah, a lot of opportunity. So having said that, whether you're here in Europe, whether in the States or anywhere, really there's like why companies get stuck seem to be pretty universal from what I've been able to tell. So the question I was going to ask Thor is like, how big are the companies that you typically work with?
So because of our type of loans are specifically geared towards monthly recurring revenue companies, and early stage, we fit again in that gap right between sort of you're done bootstrapping the company and maybe you haven't quite raised your first round of equity capital. So the types of companies that we run into on average are doing about 2 million in ARR, but we go all the way down to companies that are doing literally 200,000. They just got off the ground. Maybe they're doing 15,000 a month, kind of in that order. We can do some smaller loans, kind of in the area of about $50,000, and we can go all the way up to nearly $3 million for companies that are much more mature and maybe have broken sort of that 10 million mark in ARR. That's usually the range that we play in. On the high end of that range, you can imagine some companies as they start to grow have greater capital needs and ultimately need a bigger pool of capital. And very often the solution for that is more typical venture vehicles, equity capital. And so we play in that space. The company's just getting off the ground. So a typical loan for us is in the neighborhood of $400,000.
Okay, great. Now, I'll be the first to say that you don't need to raise money to start a business or grow a business. It's not for everyone. If you have something working, it can be great to help accelerate it. Again, that's we predictablerevenue.com raised, I think, is about 600,000 to $1 million in this type of capital. It's not using equity, but basically based off receivables and revenue and cash flow. So, but I've raised money before. So I think if you haven't raised money and you're thinking about it, just basically don't do it just to raise money because you have to, just because other people do it. Really think about the pros and cons of raising money and the type. Again, there's multiple types, and you want to be smart about raising it because it can be a lot of work.
Yeah, let me just
raise it and then use it well.
Yeah. Let me maybe just echo that. The whole premise of our company is to loan capital to the people that aren't, again, quite ready for equity capital, because it isn't for everybody. To your point, very often it's much more expensive because if you take on early capital and give up a big chunk of your company, and then you ultimately become wildly successful, you think about the cost of that equity. It is considerably higher than sort of debt vehicles, and so. You're absolutely right. You have to have stage appropriate capital. I think about this continuum of capital. You don't need to raise money immediately to start a company. Very often people use, either angels or they bootstrap it themselves. And then, ultimately they can kind of grow into the right capital that's appropriate for their stage of growth. And that's really important because it can take a long time. That is to raise equity capital, and it can be ultimately very expensive. It could be the right thing for you at a later stage. Yeah. But in those early stage companies, very often it's not. So,
So as Ben mentioned, this isn't going to be about raising capital. But I will say that when people are kind of feeling stuck with their companies, or now whether you're a consultant, and I don't know if we have any consultants here. Sometimes people think, if I just had money to spend money on X, Y, or Z, like to hire someone to spend on marketing, that would fix my problem, and that's not true. So I think a lot of the reasons revenue plateaus, one of them, as Thor mentioned, if you hear it, can be capitalization, but usually that is after you've got something growing to some extent and you want to speed it up. But let me touch on some of these reasons first. We'll kind of go back and forth. But now this first reason here, you're trying to skip a step, comes from a guy named David Skock. He's a well-known venture capitalist out east at Matrix Partners. What he says is there's these 3 steps. The first step is product market fit. Right? Okay, you get that? And again, whether you're a consultant, SaaS, whatever, this is kind of universal. First step, product market fit. Second step, finding a repeatable, predictable revenue model. Right? So let's lump that with lead generation and kind of selling. And then once you have that, the third major step is scaling, right? Growing quickly. And the problem with companies, whether they're funded or not, is that too many executives, founders want to skip the middle step. They get some kind of product market fit, and then they're like, let's just grow. And what happens is if you haven't done the ditch digging. Sorry, I was like, what's the ditch digging work of like tuning the lead generation model and your niche and your packaging and your pricing and your lead gen and sales process, all that, which can take way longer than you want it to. I mean, it could take 2 years. There's no answer for that. If you don't do that, you're not going to be able to grow. And so when you what happens is you jump too fast to trying to grow. And so you don't do the work to enable you to grow. And so you get stuck. So that's his first one. Thor, I don't know, does that resonate with you as much? Or do you sort of see people who are coming on the other side who are actually ready to, put some money in and grow?
No, you're exactly right. And I've scaled a couple of companies myself, and you're exactly right. Getting that product market fit is undoubtedly the first thing you've got to figure out. Is your product and service going to fit the market dynamics that are out there today? What is the competitive landscape? Are you highly differentiated, et cetera? Is there a real need for your market? If you don't understand that first step, you can't go to the next step, which is, now how do I create a monetization routine such that I'm able to prove commercial success? And I know exactly what that looks like. I know who my canonical buyer persona looks like. I know exactly, how to get to that person. How do I generate a lead such that my, buyer persona is reacting to it, correctly, and then I can close, a sale in the kind of the time frame and under the right cost structure that, I can find a repeatable step. Then and only then can you go on to put more gas in the tank. And that usually, to your earlier point, comes in the form of capital. And then you can scale it to the point where you can, really start to get, market dominance. But if you don't do them in those orders, you're very likely to get it wrong. You try to scale before you actually understand how to sell to that buyer persona, then you're going to waste a lot of money along the way. So I couldn't agree more that it's a very sort of stepwise approach.
Yep. And again, I think one of the challenges is it can take a lot longer than people want to get to that point where you have some repeatability and some predictability in both the lead generation and sales model. And it's even harder if you have a services model, right? Professional services of some kind, because those don't lend themselves quite to as much on the repeatable kind of packaging and program delivery sides. It's not impossible, but tend to be a little trickier. So let's move on. Number two, not enough sales roles. So again, assuming you actually have a couple people in sales, maybe one, maybe three or more. I don't know if I've ever run into a company that had too many sales roles, but I run into them all the time that don't have enough. And one thing I've seen is that if you don't have the right roles in revenue and sales defined, everything is harder. It's like you literally have sand in the gears. For example, all right, expecting all your salespeople to do all their own prospecting. Basically, it's just a lot of comes down to having people in the sales or revenue roles and expecting them to carry too many hats, to do too many things well. It's impossible to do everything well. And again, like any sports team, I don't know any sports team where the coach tells the whole team, okay, everybody attack and everybody defend. There's no way. But with salespeople especially, and even in marketing, kind of want them to do everything. It's changing slowly, but if you, like what I see is that most companies still don't specialize far enough or kind of the right way. And I'll give you two examples of mistakes people make. The most blatant one are having a junior sales role, right? A sales development rep. There's many names for this, right? An appointment setter. And that appointment setter, or there's not just one, there might be like two, some number of them, and they're mixing both the jobs of inbound lead response and outbound prospecting, right? Because at the surface level, those jobs seem similar, right? They're making calls, sending emails, whether they're doing inbound response or outbound prospecting, but the jobs are actually completely different mindset, process, comp, metrics. They're all completely different. They need to be completely separate. So one more example is, again, having salespeople doing too much account management or customer success, supporting customers, and then basically getting stuck and not able to bring in new customers. So specialization begins once you have really one person. They can specialize their time. And as soon as you have two, generally you want to have one junior person and one senior person. So do you?
Yeah, I again, obviously agree with. And I think what I'd like to add is that it becomes particularly hard on earlier stage companies for obvious reasons. If as you're growing, you're trying to scale out the organization, people tend to be conservative with, where they're actually investing dollars, and they don't invest enough on the sales side, to your point. And so you get people that are basically trying to be a jack of all trades in a very complex sales cycle. In this innovation economy, I would suspect that most of your audience here is, they're selling, some fairly complex solutions to the marketplace. And to be able to be an expert about the product or service in and of itself, and oh, by the way, understand not only how to both generate leads, generate interest, do that hunting versus farming of your existing customers. It is a kind of a multi-headed monster, if you will. And if you try to have one individual that tries to do it all, it can be exceedingly challenging. And again, harder to do on earlier stage companies, because as you're growing, you're just trying to fill out the ranks of who are the right people in the right place. And I see it all the time. We underinvest in sales and we wonder why we're not growing as fast as we could be.
Yep. But we had a couple comments in the chat, which I don't bring up because they're perfect. Harry mentioned, for example, they made a mistake of hiring too many sales people, and basically not enough support sales roles. Now, one of the trends, which I love to see, because this makes so much sense, is again, more pre-sales roles, like sort of like SDR types. There's SDRs, BDRs, LDRs, whatever the inbound lead response, outbound prospecting. Again, there could be like sales engineers, sales ops, thankfully, is growing. Sales, what do they call them? Sales enablement. There's all these terms for people who are related to the sales process that may not be closing. Right? And so the variety of sales roles is so important, and you need a lot more support. And whether it's documentation, defining, sales just is more complicated today. And so there needs to be more support than people appreciate to make salespeople successful. Along the same lines, customer success can be part of this kind of revenue. It's more like a revenue model rather than just a sales model.
Yeah. What I was going to also comment on the fact that if you think about, salespeople, they generally are some of your more expensive people in the organization. When you think about the total compensation package, they tend to be generally more expensive. And so what I have found is that you're actually much more cost effective if you have to your point, have more support and BDRs, SDRs, what have you. And actually, as a percentage, fewer salespeople, because you make those salespeople much more effective. So those dollars go a lot further, and the salespeople are often much more effective. Your close rates times are shorter, et cetera, if you surround them with the right people. So again, that diversity of roles actually increases your efficiency or productivity of that team. And from a cost perspective, it's often lower.
Yep. And it can take, again, a lot more time and months than people expect or want to get things tuned in, like whether the CRM or Salesforce tools you're using and sales enablement. And there's so many nuts and bolts to tighten. And so if you don't have someone or not ready to even hire someone in-house, whether there's contractors or like really find a way to invest in all the knowledge to figure how to make sales kind of tune the engine. And there's just infinite details, whether it's on the outbound side alone or sales or process. And there's so many apps. It's just getting more complicated, and that's going to continue. But quick question here from Dennis, sort of thoughts on outsourcing the hunter function. It's called lead generation, at least appointment setting. There's a lot of outsourcing options today, not just in sales, but kind of everything. And the first thing I would caution you on with outsourcing is that it's not some sort of silver bullet. And by the way, predictablerevenue.com does a lot of outsourcing, whether it's like we would say remote team building and management. So, but I'll be the first to say, you have to be smart about, just like raising money, if you're going to outsource or not, what's the right way to do it, and what's the right fit for you. Some people can do it very successfully, and some people struggle. And a lot of that comes down to, there's partly the kind of product and market you're in, because if you're in a very commoditized market, Could be like VoIP or communication systems or website design or bars. It's a lot more challenging to do it and to outsource it unless you have like a really super specialist firm you found. So even if you do outsource it, being prepared to do a lot of work to make that partnership successful. I think where people fail is, I'm just going to write a check to some company and they're going to figure it out. And that does not work. And whether it's in software development or lead generation.
Yeah, and I've used outsourced some of those functions as well historically. And you said something there that really resonated with me, and that is the amount of time that is required to enable that function. So to your earlier point, if you have a fairly commoditized product or solution, the amount of time that you're constantly spending with your outsourced contractors to make sure they get them up to speed can be less versus a fairly complex solution or service that you're taking to the market. So I would say on that ecosystem or that spectrum, if you will, if you're a more complex solution, I would tend to have it in-house because you can touch those people every day. You can constantly enable, you can pivot faster in the market. If it's fairly commoditized, it's often more cost-effective to outsource. However, when you do that calculation of what the cost is, you need to consider what is the support function cost to make sure that you're making sure that those people are effective.
So I just put a link in the chat. So the new book, The Impossible to Inevitable book, second edition, has a section on, one section is how to build an outbound sales team right the first time. And I put a link to a blog article excerpt. And there's another section on how to build your first sales team. But I think one of the things I'd emphasize too is being thoughtful about, who's your market and, who are your customers and what's the right model for you. Outsourcing generally, I think, is a better fit, something to consider if you're really tight on management attention. Hiring and training your own people is usually the best long-term solution, but it might take a lot more time and energy than you might be prepared to do. And there's many reasons why that may not be the right fit. So kind of know yourself, your business, what you want to accomplish, and then be ready for it to take time, right? Months. A lot of times we'll say, actually I did a webinar a few weeks ago with a guy named Colin Cadmus from Aircall. And he said that he thinks that if you're building an outbound sales team or an outbound prospecting team, right, outbound SDRs, that it can be up to 3 years to kind of get the team in place and build a pipeline and see like enough like real revenue from it. And I would say that would be if you're in a challenging market, right? A relatively commoditized one. It can be a lot faster, but we often might say 18 months. So, and a lot of people don't want to hear that. They want to know, okay, I want to make money in months. And you're not preparing yourself with the right expectations to stick it out and make it work. So let's move on. By the way, we'll come back to some of the chat, a lot of great questions and comments in there, but we'll save some of those for the end. Word of mouth dependence is what I've seen trip up most companies. And what this means is a company gets to a few $100,000, a few million in revenue. And they start, our inbound leads have started to plateau. So let's invest in outbound marketing or basically paid growth, marketing, sales. Of course, I saw this mostly when people were building outbound teams and they struggle. Or they might have hired salespeople for the first time and they struggle. What they didn't realize was a lot of their business really was dependent on relationships and brand. People were coming to them, again, customer referrals and word of mouth and investor relationships, and the founders were selling and things were great. And then as soon as they started spending money to get to people outside their network, it was a waste, right? So this lesson that to be ready to grow, like you're not going to be ready to grow until you nail a niche. And that means to be independent, to be able to do lead generation and sell without having to depend on relationships. Relationships are amazing. Word of mouth is amazing. But when you become dependent on it, then it becomes a problem.
Yeah, because it's not scalable, obviously. And that's really the trick. Early stage companies leverage They're relationships. That's how they're often built by, founders. But ultimately, those are not scalable relationships. And this kind of goes back to, I think, one of your very early points in terms of those steps. Until you've figured out that sort of repeatable, kind of scalable, only then do you put in the capital so that you can actually start to scale. You can't do it otherwise. But that I think that kind of describes exactly what many of these founders go through. How do you get beyond that?
Yeah, it's a little tricky for founders because they don't see it because they're just so used to people being more attentive and bought in because they've got that founder magic. So it's usually once they hire the first salesperson, or again they invest for the first time in some sort of paid growth, like an outbound program or online marketing, and it doesn't work. And like, what's the problem? And I think an example is you might have messaging from in the early days like this idea of, hey, we're a lean, agile team of consultants, analysts, and so on. That to you might make a lot of sense, but to other people, it just is confusing. Or you might have a product that you're like, wow, everyone can use this. We have cash flow management tool to get people your cash flow underway or under control. Everyone should use this. Okay, yeah, but the problem is when you're trying to speak to everybody, no one really hears you. It's like a radio station that says, hey, we can broadcast, like, what do you want? We can do rock, hip hop, jazz, blues, classical, opera. Like, we got it all. It just confuses customers versus when you can say, we just do this one thing really well for this one type of customer. And that signal becomes super clear and your market can really tune into you. So this idea of nailing a niche is really about being really tuned into the best customer who needs you the most, and how to talk to them in a language that they understand that and can recognize it. So one more thing, when I use the word niche, in Europe they say niche, in Canada they say niche. Really, it's not about having like a smaller goal or smaller vision. It's about being focused, right? Not trying to be everything to everyone or being too many things to too many people. It's there's this Uber trend in the world of just too much, more content, more channels, more messages, more everything, more apps. And so the rising tide is overwhelming confusion. What counters that is focus, right? So nailing a niche means being more focused on the right customer with the right message. In fact, that's why sales specialization works, right? People doing fewer things better. So I think this is where I would start, which would be how do you define when you're a nice to have versus when you're a need to have? This is one of the best places to start to be more insightful and targeted about not only who you go after, but what kind of message would appeal to them. So you can be so clear with your technique and your message that things like outbound prospecting or online marketing will actually work for you. And when they start to work that way, when you can start to get some paid growth working, that's when you can start to spend more money and actually see the return come in. All right. I don't know if people can hear. We moved to Edinburgh with 5 of the 9 kids, and I don't know if it's coming through. I can hear.
Sounds like you got a house full there.
Yeah. Yeah, but they know they're trying to be kept occupied. They know where I am, so there's no like safe place here. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, it's funny. They're cute. So I will say it's a lot of work. I don't know how many of you are entrepreneurs or parents, but it takes a lot of work to have those babies. But there's a lot of, but the rewards are there too. Speak of the devil.
Says I can't just watch.
Yeah, laughing is great, but yeah, when there's crying and screaming, it's no fun. All right, yeah, no, honestly, I have these moments. I always remember, like, when I saw, who was the guy who was talking about North Korea on the BBC live when, like, his family came in on. So, yeah, I think anyone else here work from home and have that happen? Yeah, all the time.
Several times.
Yeah, we have. So, now this fourth one, Thor, I think unpredictable lead generation is one that, of course, the whole book Predictable Revenue is based around the idea that if you disconnect this idea that salespeople should prospect and have prospecting, which is separate from closing, and then if you can make the lead generation predictable, that will lead to predictable revenue. Now, whatever the method of lead generation, whether it's content, inbound, outbound, midbound, outbound, whatever it is, like as long as you can find a way to make it predictable, then you have one of your key steps towards being able to control some growth. Of course, my specialty tends to be outbound, but the principle is funnels. Can you put together a funnel with that channel or that type of campaign? Can you measure that? Can you define the steps? Can you measure it somehow, whether it's trade shows, again, online marketing, interviews, podcasts, outbound? Where are you seeing some traction and how do you do more of that? So I think the most common mistake people make around lead generation, one is trying to do too many things. Again, trying to do too many things, too many types of marketing programs, too many types of lead generation efforts, especially in marketing, because you've got a million types of ways you can market yourself. So how common is it just you kind of spread your energy over too many mini projects and you don't get real traction in any one of them? So I think the first step is, if you have had some successful lead gen, even a little bit, focus on, okay, where have been the best places you've generated some leads so far? How can you, double down on that? And maybe add one or just two types of new programs to kind of invest in to bring online over the next several months.
Yeah, and you brought up something there that really resonated with me as we run a pretty large marketing and lead gen operation here at Lighter Capital, and one of the things that we want to do, again, that really resonated with me is that incremental approach to marketing. If you've got too many programs running at the same time, then getting that attribution model, we're trying to effectively measure which actually created which lead, is super, super important. Otherwise, you tend to peanut butter your cash over multiple efforts because you don't really understand which one has the highest output. And when we see this all the time, and because it's marketing and because behaviors are often hard to measure, the attribution model in and of itself is a very hard thing to do. In other words, I spent $1 here and it generated this exact, cohort of leads. Getting that right is super important, because only then, when you really understand how to measure and getting that attribution model correct, only then can you take the next step to say, okay, now I can launch another program and I can see what the effective impact is to my, aggregate lead source. So the measurement thing is super important, and too many balls or not moving in an incremental step is often something that I see in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's kind of, sorry, there's in the slide upload, they cut off a word, right? It's supposed to say predictable lead generation is your lever for growth on this one. I think we want people to get away from this idea of, hey, if I just build a great product or do a great service, I'll grow. Not really. How do you have some kind of proactive way to generate leads in a predictable way, no matter what the business is? I think just kind of building what Thor said, one of the places people really go wrong is not slowing down and really digging into the details around where the leads came from and what triggered them, kind of lump them all together. And a perfect example is inbound leads. So let's say you get 100 inbound leads a month, or 10, and they could come from all over the place, right? Classic mistake. You are looking at your website and you say, hey, we got 10 demo requests, 5 contact me's, and 50 webinars. So we got to do more webinars. Okay, well, what you haven't done yet is really those are the kind of the types of leads you're getting. But what you need to do is the next level, which is what's the lead source? Like what triggered those people to come to the website next for the demo? And it's hard to do this until you actually usually have to talk to the leads themselves. Typically, the people on the phone say, hey, how'd you originally hear about us? What brought you to, whether it's an event or a site or a webinar? So there's kind of that manual interviewing type-ish step which just kind of gets lost in the shuffle, to really to get that sense of where did that lead come from? Like what really triggered the original source of the lead? And attribution is tough, but it can take, and going back to the very beginning, which is the idea of skipping a step, a lot of this like very, I would say slow, but kind of a lot of this detail type work and investigation to really put the pieces together to that insight into what originally is driving things so that we can understand, okay, we figured out what is driving the leads and sort of what's driving sales. So now we have a better picture of how to multiply that. And there's no, or rarely some sort of like overnight success, right? Oh, we just put up this viral video and we blew up. Or we just launched our beta and we blew up. Like that just doesn't happen, or it's so rare it's not worth considering. It's a lot of that slow, incremental, ongoing improvement that's really boring, that people don't talk about. It doesn't make it gets no social media views because it's so boring, but that's the day in, day out of making this kind of thing successful and getting that predictable lead generation to work, whether it's outbound or whether it's inbound. There's a couple of outbound questions, so happy to kind of jump into that. Unless Thor, you want to chime in on the, what does it take to actually create predictable lead generation? Anything else? Yeah,
that's a really hard one. Again, we're going to kick a dead horse here. It's what first and foremost, you've got to understand your market. So, in order for you to launch a campaign, you have to be deeply entrenched in your market, which means you've got to be a thought leader in that space. You've got to attend events, so on and so forth. And my point is you have to educate yourself of what is your buyer persona looking for? What are the challenges that they face every single day? Because if you don't understand those initial market dynamics, then you're not able to attract them to your product or service offering. So really understanding the dynamics that they face, whether it's seasonality, dynamics in their own marketplace that that trigger particular growth cycles or lack thereof. If you really got to understand what they face every day, only then can you position your product in such a way to gain their attention. And once you've got those pieces fixed, then it's all about. In some cases, I hate to say it, but very often it's trial and error, whether it's inbound, whether it's a
so
form
true,
of digital marketing. But if you're not measuring it effectively, then you don't know which ones are working. So I try to be, and I've been at a variety of different companies, I try to be an expert in that particular space. I try to understand exactly what they face. I try to put myself in their shoes. And then you can, I often build, several companies in the past, what I've done is build an advisory council made up of, canonical customer set. And I rotate that so that it doesn't get stale. But getting their ongoing feedback about how the product and service is working in the marketplace, and also how the positioning and the collateral and the brand is being received in the marketplace. So you can test that with a group of friendlies. If you surround yourself with, potential buyers, they're going to be very candid with you. And so that's one way to, start to dial in what's working, but then it becomes trial and error, trying a variety of different campaigns.
I know.
And
people hate hearing that
output.
though. Like, don't tell me it's trial and error. Just give me the answer. Well, actually,
there isn't one, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I would double emphasize the fact you stop asking your team and friends for feedback on your messaging, whether it's like a book, email, basically people who know you too well because they're biased. What you really want to do is get feedback from people who are unfamiliar with you or what you do. It's harder, but people who are biased are not going to give you actually great feedback is what you need.
Yeah, and it can't just be anybody. It's got to be somebody that represents the market that you're going after so that you get, appropriate feedback from, prospects.
Yeah. So I'm going to do a couple minutes here on outbound and we'll have some time for questions. So again, these three types of leads, basically word of mouth, marketing, and outbound are all different. And they have different processes and funnels and metrics. You just got to kind of really break things down, understand however you're generating leads, what's worked, How can you start by doing more of what's already worked before you try to dilute your focus by doing too many different kinds of projects? But within Outbound, there's so much obsession with what's the email template and what's the phone script, and rightly so. I get that. There's all this AI stuff. There's all these things out there now, but ultimately, again, it's not even just Outbound. What really matters isn't kind of how you do it. It's all about the metrics. Like, what does the dashboard say? Now, unfortunately, it's actually quite challenging to get accurate dashboards with Outbound, especially. It can be with anything, but especially with Outbound, because there's a lot more subjectivity in Outbound typically. Is this qualified or not? And varying degrees of training between the prospectors and even salespeople as to qualification. So it takes a lot more diligence to get accurate metrics. And there's a lot of questions around, like, was this really outbound or not, called attribution. So anyway, really dialing, if you have an outbound program, this is the place to start. How can you make the metrics trustworthy? Because if you can't trust them, it's like trying to drive a car. This is our family car. It's like, if you can't trust your speedometer or your maps directions, where's your confidence? And unfortunately, a lot of outbound dashboards, especially, are not accurate enough to give you a clear picture on actually what's working, what's not, and where should you invest or what do you need to fix. So that's step one. And I think the main place, the main metric that I see missing across pretty much every team that we do assessments with is this idea of the number of qualified opportunities, but it needs to be audited in some way. It needs to be every single opportunity claimed for outbound credit needs to be checked for consistency, for notes, for the fact it's actually outbound, and some of these other criteria, in order to have some confidence that what you're saying, claiming the amount of qualified pipeline being generated is truly there, it's real, it's not being too fluffed, and it's actually outbound. So I would say that's one of the, I don't know, it's so rare that companies do this. So that would be the first place to start if you have a team, is to go back and check it, because otherwise I guarantee I can't say whether it's 20% of your pipeline is wrong or 5% or more. The significant enough amount of your pipeline from outbound will be inaccurate if you're not doing that. And everyone's funnels are a bit different. There's Jim Duffy had a question around what's the right kind of mix, phone, email. Everyone tends to have this in B2B, this mix of phone, email, and LinkedIn. Right? LinkedIn has grown quite a bit. Email and phone are always a bit on the decline. That's not going to change. LinkedIn is still on the rise. At some point, that'll decline. There's always some mix. The actual mix might vary based on your market, because some people are targeting customers who are going to be more responsive to the phone, like smaller businesses, some more email, and some LinkedIn. Usually want some mix of all three. And the exact way you mix is going to be up to you in that trial and error to find the right one. This is an example from the Impossible to Inevitable book, from a case study on Zora that's in the second edition, just what they do. So kind of like some activity levels, how they really focus on a lot of enterprise. They do have a goal for a number of accounts to get mapped per month. And if you have enterprise, your funnel will be, again, different than if you have a very transactional sale and outbound system. So it's kind of like, there's a lot of diets that work out there. There's a lot of famous books, but ultimately, whatever the book is you read for an eating system or exercise regime, you're going to have to kind of take it and make it your own. And an outbound funnel is the same way. So what I would say on the outbound side, just to kind of close this out, the slide formatting here did not work out so well in the upload, is that there's a lot of mistakes. I'm not sure how many people here actually have an outbound team in place yet, but if you do, there's a workshop I'm doing at SaaStr called 7 Outbound Sales Mistakes that even smart leaders make. And these are some kind of basic samples of them. Right? I mentioned mixing inbound and outbound. Right? Those have to be completely separate as long as you have more than one person. Prospectors being tied to specific salespeople, really no more than 4. Salespeople have to have territories, some version of segments or territories. And managers can't have more. You really should not be managing more than 10, maybe even no more than 6 or 8 people, depending on how much change is going on. But these are some samples of just consistently like the challenges, or I'd say design errors that leaders of outbound teams make, that I'm trying to kind of put some more insights around how people design the teams better. Sort of like a healthier soil. Like you can have the right techniques, like the right seeds and the right watering regime, but if your soil isn't healthy, at some point it's just not going to work. So let me put this on the last couple slides, and if you have some questions, throw them in the chat. We talked about some of these things, like slowing down to really kind of dig into the details on what's working, what's not, so you can be insightful about how to, well, what's not working, and then grow what is working, right? Add more roles in sales, nailing a niche. You really get to know like who your ideal customer is, what they want, and speak to them in their language, not yours. And then with predictable lead generation, if you are doing outbound, you want to fix your dashboards to start. If you're not doing outbound, or again, this could be some other significant kind of initiative like content marketing, pick one person to own that and figure out a plan. It's a way to get started. So, and I'm sorry, Thor, before we get to chat, is it lightercapital.com that you're at?
It is. Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Lightercapital.com. And you could throw a link or email some other way in the chat for people. We got some questions here. We got about 5 minutes or so. Sorry, and I missed one. Jim had a good question, which was in outbound, has anything changed for us from the last year? What do we see? There haven't been, it's kind of more of the same of these trends, right? The trends include more apps and more technology, which means more complexity, more channels, more messaging. So the way this impacts people are prospectors tend to be overwhelmed more easily because there's so many tools and things they need to do. So really working on a simplified kind of workflow and playbook is very important. How to keep things simple for them as much as possible. It's an ongoing challenge. That's one thing. And, getting email response rates, LinkedIn response rates, phone response rates, those are all going to continue in general to decline a bit, which means not that outbound doesn't work, but just means you have to be better, more in tune with who your customers are, more in tune with the messaging that appeals to them. It's not like content marketing. 10 or 15 years ago, you could throw up a blog and boom, you're on the first page of Google. Today, there's so much content. You have to be really good and you have to be persistent to make it take off. But once you do, then you can see the dividends. Same thing, that's where outbound is going to go. One more thing, average revenue generated by an SDR. It's hard to say averages because it depends on deal sizes, but I would probably say like 600,000 a year in annual revenue to $1 million isn't untypical. Could be less, could be more, but it's probably like a fair range for a successful program, which is a whole different story. There we go. So Thor threw his firm's link into the chat. Any other questions here? Peggy said, we use email video, can see when they look at video, great. By the way, with video and GIFs and personalization, I keep hearing different stories. Some people, it works really well. Some people, it doesn't work. We haven't seen a lot of success with it, but I think things like video and GIFs really are very dependent on the person doing it, kind of like social media. Some people just have a good knack for social media and some people don't. Some people are going to have a good knack for video, some people won't. So that's going to be something that varies more in terms of results by person, even on one team. So, hey, Thor, there's a question here. What, if any, advisory services does Lighter Capital offer to your lending clients?
We don't have formal advisory services in the form of like, investment banking or, additional insights, post-revenue growth around marketing, et cetera. But our investment professionals, we do, well over 200 loans a year, for example. Okay. So yeah. Our investment professionals really understand some of those dynamics, and they offer advice along the way about their preparation and different types of capital. So one of education, but not formal services.
Yeah. Okay. Great answer. I'll have one last one, Dennis here. Any guidelines, perspectives on how much to invest proportionally on inbound versus outbound to drive scale? So Dennis, here's the answer. At some point, it'll probably be roughly 50-50, but where you want to start with is whatever's working better for you now, do more of that. So if inbound has been working, and by working, I don't just mean leads, but it's actually kind of delivering the kinds of clients you want at the deal sizes and so on. How can you double that first? If it's not working, then you have to decide, maybe we don't double, maybe we should start outbound. And there are reasons to do that based on, going up market, bigger deal sizes and so on. If outbound's been working, how can you double or triple that first before diluting your energy in doing inbound? So you want to pick one of them, the better one to focus on for, again, probably more like 6 to 18 months, and really get it dialed in before making a significant investment in the other program. And it's not just inbound or outbound, right? I'd say customer success is really the best way to try to drive more word of mouth. Like if you don't have customers, that's really number one. And partners, for some companies, it's not all, might be another type of channel to invest in. Again, partners are the same in a lot of ways, right? You can acquire them through outbound or market to them, find them through word of mouth. And you need to kind of identify who your ideal partners are. So they can be great. Partners can be great to make money with once they're working, but it can be harder to find a good partner. And sometimes it's hard. You have to spend a lot of time before you even know if they're going to work. So easier to waste time and energy with partners. So I want to thank Thor for doing this with me and everyone who jumped on. It's 7 p.m. I'm sure I have a bunch of little kids out there like clamoring for daddy. So I'm going to head back to them. Again, if you're going to be at SaaStr, love to see you there in San Jose. I'll be there March 12th. Our company will be there, but I will fly in on the 11th to speak on the 12th, doing that 7 outbound sales mistakes that even smart sales leaders make workshop, kind of mid-morning. I think it was sold out, but they reopened some new spaces, so there might be some more slots in that workshop. Go get a Guinness. I can't drink anymore because I don't have the energy. I just get tired. So as much as I would enjoy Guinness, I need to be awake a little longer. My team, fun fact, is still in mostly in Vancouver, 8 hours behind. So this tends to be a bit more of a working time for me. Don't worry, I have a great life. So anyway, thanks everybody, and thanks Thor.
Thank you.